On today's show, the final stretch run is here. We'll look at the Eastern and Western wildcard races. What's wrong in Minnesota? Seth Tupal joins us to discuss. And the LA Kings are elite on home ice after last night's win over the New York Rangers.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome inside this Wednesday, March 26th edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. I'm Ross Levitan from Locked On Ottawa Senators. With me is Gil Martin from Locked On New York Islanders on a wild Wednesday. After a busy night in the National Hockey League that saw a lot of wild card teams say, I'm not sure if we want that, with losses in the standings. We'll get into all that. We're going to be joined by Seth Tupal and Eddie Garcia from Locked On Wild and Locked On Kings, respectively, to take a look at their teams. But Gil, we got to start with the Eastern Conference wildcard race. Both of our teams are cemented in the race right now, and your team, the Islanders, have quite the game tonight against the Vancouver Canucks.
Yeah, that's a game where, both teams have a lot at stake in their respective wildcard races. And, it's amazing because you win a couple of games in a row and you shoot up the standings and it looks like, you're a lock and everything's looking good. And then if you lose a couple in a row, you can go from in the playoffs to, 3 teams that you would need to jump. So it's just so tight, but it's also all of these teams are so inconsistent that nobody seems to want to claim that final spot and run with it.
Final spot as the team with the first wild card spot. I'm still nervous every night watching the Ottawa Senators right now, who have a 5-point lead over the Islanders with the same amount, 70 games played. But it just feels like every time the Senators have an opportunity like they did last night to jump and put a bit of gap between them and the rest of the teams, they can't do it. The Senators fell 3-2 to the Buffalo Sabres last night, who all of a sudden are coming off back-to-back wins. They got a big one in Winnipeg on Sunday as well. But yeah, this race, it feels like now we're down to the brass tacks, though. Like, we're down to who the 4 or 5 teams are. For a while, it was everybody had a chance to make the playoffs. But you got to think now, after Columbus, it's starting to look pretty ominous for Detroit. Boston, you can pretty much put a fork in them. 3 straight losses now, and they moved on from all those players at the deadline. They're 6 points out, and they've played 2 more games than both Montreal, Ottawa, and the New York Islanders, and the Columbus Blue Jackets, who got a huge win over your Islanders the other night. What'd you think of that goal? I'm sure you talked about it on the Locked On Islanders podcast, but right at the end of regulation, Kyle Palmieri thought he won the game, but it gets called back with goaltender interference.
Yeah, I mean, the way I put it is this. Nobody right now can tell you what is and is not goalie interference. And it seems like from an Islanders perspective, they've had some of their own goals called off, and then some other teams have had goals that were upheld. And, the league at the end of the season just needs to codify what it is clearly and then enforce it consistently, because right now you don't want to see a playoff series or the Stanley Cup affected by a call that people are just going to be arguing about endlessly because nobody knows what goalie interference is and what goalie interference isn't.
And especially in a wild card race where you're playing a team that you could have really helped out yourself by not allowing to get 1 point and then ultimately 2 with the shootout. It's tough, man. I don't know how you put an exact verbiage on it because there is so much gray area, but that one, it felt like 1, Merzlikins created the contact, and then 2, I'd say he had enough time to reset before the shot went in. So really tough. What a reaction shot they showed in the crowd. That fan after the non-call, he could not believe it, completely beside himself. But the Islanders, with those back-to-back OT losses, are still right in the mix, just 1 point back of the Montreal Canadiens. And talk about just getting points to get those critical OT losses. Look at Montreal's last 10 games. They've only got 4 wins, but they've got 4 extra points on top of that has helped them stay in that second wild card spot. So it's going to be quite the sprint to the finish line. Columbus all of a sudden looks energized. And for me, looking at this through the Ottawa Senators lens, Gil, the Sens play the Blue Jackets 3 times. They have not played Columbus yet this year. So if Columbus somehow sweeps that season series, all of a sudden they're challenging Ottawa for a spot. So it's going to be awesome to see. And Ottawa's only got 1 game left against the Western Conference. Only Chicago. Everything else is in the East. So these head-to-head games, like, we may as well say the playoffs have already started for these teams that are in the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, as you alluded to earlier, those overtime and shootout losses, those 3-point games, put a monkey wrench into a lot of the standings. And then, as a fan of either or of any of these teams, you often go into a game saying, I don't care which team wins, but just don't let it go to overtime or a shootout, because I don't want both teams to be getting at least a point under the circumstances.
Which is why I was cheering for that goal to count against the Columbus Blue Jackets. But all jokes aside, you look at the Rangers in here too. Only 3 wins in their last 10 games. But the irony there, and to our point, is that they have the first tiebreaker with every team around them. So if they can muster off a few wins, they've got Anaheim and San Jose coming up next. Like, they could put themselves right into a spot. It's going to be so much theater down the stretch. Where would you draw the line? Like, do you think Detroit still has a shot here as well?
I think they do. I mean, they're only 3 points out. That's where I would draw the line. Anyone behind Detroit at this point, not going to get there. But essentially, you have 5 teams within 3 points of each other fighting for that last wild card, and then Ottawa 4 points ahead of Montreal right now. And each team has somewhere between 10 and 12 games left.
And with Ottawa, it's always talked about on our show that they have the quote-unquote easiest strength of schedule, and then they go into Buffalo and lay an egg. So it only matters if you can win those games that you're, quote, supposed to win. Now, the one thing about Ottawa is that after their game on Thursday, they will play almost all of their remaining games at home. They still have 9 home games left on the season out of the 12 remaining games. So they're in a good spot there, having home ice and a cushion, if you will, over the teams that are chasing them. But Montreal falling in St. Louis, and everybody's falling to St. Louis right now, the hottest team in the National Hockey League. You can go check out Haley on Locked On Blues for more on their, I don't want to call it miraculous, because we've seen it before in 2019 when they rattled off an elite second half of the season to make the playoffs. We'll get into the Western Conference wildcard more. And like, St. Louis might even be pushing Minnesota now for the first wild card. And we'll talk about how that could have an impact going into the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. But Montreal, obviously, they've been impressive since the Four Nations. They've hit a bit of a slide recently with a couple OT losses and the regulation loss last night to St. Louis. But if you're power ranking the teams right now with 12 games left, like, who do you think has the best opportunity to make those 2 spots?
Wow. I mean, if you're talking about the East, I think Ottawa will get one of them. And, I have to think Montreal is the favorite to get that last spot. But, like you said, the Rangers do have the tiebreaker. Columbus is sort of a sentimental favorite because of everything that organization has been through over the course of this season. It is really going to come down to the wire. And the problem is none of these teams are consistent enough to pull away. So whoever gets hot at the right time is going to get this spot, because all these teams seem so evenly matched right now.
And I think this week will really even make it more complicated, because, as I mentioned, it's going to be a, quote, easier schedule for the Rangers. And for Montreal, that was game 1 of a 4-game road trip. They've got Philly next, and we'll talk about Torts' comments later. And then they're in Carolina and Florida. Then they come home and play Florida. So they did beat the Panthers already this season, but that's going to be a tough stretch for them to really solidify their spot in a wild card race. Stay with us throughout the rest of the season and beyond here on Locked On NHL. We are your first, second, and it could be all the way up to your 34th listen here on the Locked On NHL channel. We have local experts on the biggest stories 5 days a week here, and we do it on Locked On NHL as well. We'll hear from one of our great hosts, Seth Tupal, on the other side. What the heck is going on with the Minnesota Wild? That's next. You're listening to Locked On NHL, your team every day.
Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. I've been in that spot where you need to hire like yesterday. Well, the pressure is on, and every day without the right person is a setback. That's exactly where Indeed sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. Now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed, is all you need.
Welcome back, Locked On NHL, your team every day. We're part of Locked On Podcast Network, providing local experts on the biggest stories 5 days a week. And one of the biggest stories for me down the stretch is the Minnesota Wild. One, because I'm kind of cheering for them to be in that second wild card spot, Gil. We know there's a heated rivalry between Minnesota and Winnipeg, and I think that would make for great theater in round one of the playoffs. But Minnesota of late, they're stumbling. Back-to-back losses. They get shut out in Dallas 3-0. Then they lose 5-1 to Vegas in last night's game. And the big question is, where is Kirill Kaprizov too? I mean, they need him back so badly. For more on the Wild, here's Seth Dupal.
Well, the Minnesota Wild scored a goal for the first time in 5 periods, but objects in the mirror continue to get closer and closer and closer. Hey, everybody, Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, recapping a 5-1 loss to the Vegas Golden Knights. The Wild fell behind 1-0 in the first. They gave up another goal in the second. They got one back, courtesy of Marcus Johansson's 8th goal of the season, before Vegas broke it open in the third. Jack Eichel recorded a hat trick, and it's a Minnesota Wild team that is just grasping at straws for offense right now. They are not able to finish on many of their opportunities. And now St. Louis, if they hold on and win tonight, is just 2 points back for the first wild card spot in the Western Conference. Things are getting dicey. For more on the Minnesota Wild, make sure you follow Locked On Wild wherever you listen to your podcasts.
All right, there's Seth Dupal, one of our great hosts here on the Locked On NHL Network. What do you make of this lack of offense for the Minnesota Wild?
A lot of it is injury related. I mean, even when they're healthy, as of this point, they're 25th in the league in goals scored. So, the Wild don't get it done with offense under normal circumstances. And then, you mentioned Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek also out of the lineup. When you are already struggling to score goals, you can't afford to lose 2 players that can help you score goals. 2 of your, especially Kaprizov, who's, arguably their best offensive weapon. So, this is a team that just has trouble putting the puck in the net. And now, they just cannot seem to get out of their own way as far as scoring enough to win hockey games. Puts a lot of pressure on Philip Gustafsson and the rest of the players, who are probably squeezing their sticks a little tighter than they want to be, because they know there's pressure to provide offense in the absence of Eriksson Ek and Kaprizov.
And it's tough, Gil, when Philip Gustafsson has more goals for the Minnesota Wild this year than Gustav Nyquist, who they played a second-round pick to get. And I know it's just been 12 games, but no goals for Nyquist since coming over in that trade. And their other deadline pickup, Justin Brazeau, only has 1 goal and no assists in 10 games. So you're looking at a 12-game sample. The 2 of them combined play 22 games so far and have 1 goal and 2 assists. That's just not going to cut it when you're missing your top 2 guys up front in Eriksson Ek and Kaprizov. So they need those 2 guys back quickly. The only thing that they have in their favor is 1 game in hand and 2 points above the St. Louis Blues, who are charging up the standings, winners of 7 in a row. Now, with that said, Calgary's won 4 straight games. They're now 4 points back of St. Louis, and Calgary has games in hand on everybody. 2 on Minnesota, 3 on St. Louis. They're firmly in the mix. And the Vancouver Canucks, finally, Elias Pettersson gets hot, and then he gets injured. It really feels like, for me, I watched that whole New Jersey Devils Vancouver Canucks game the other night. It really feels like that's Quinn Hughes and a bunch of other people that are trying to fill a role. Quinn Hughes is outstanding, a top 10 player in the National Hockey League. He is doing everything he can. He even had a breakaway in overtime after 31 minutes of ice time already in the game. Yep. He's willing that team, and they're going to need Thatcher Demko. Came back, let in a couple tough goals against New Jersey, but also made some huge saves. There was one in particular going left to right. I believe it was in overtime to rob the Devils of a victory there. They're showing heart. They're scoring late. They tied the game late against New Jersey. They did it twice against the Rangers, but still couldn't hang on for a regulation win. Kevin Lankinen allowed, I believe, 4 goals on 14 shots, if I'm not mistaken, in that game. It feels like they can't put it all together. And that's why they're taking a step back. Before the season, and they were a top 3 team in the Pacific last year. It feels like, for me, they're the team that's really struggling to stay in the race. Utah's hanging around, albeit by a thread. But to me, we're getting closer and closer to having this be a 3-horse race here, with Calgary and St. Louis vaulting up the standings on their recent win streaks.
Yeah, and Calgary just won't go away, and it all has to do with goaltending more than anything else. That is, been the big surprise that has kept the Flames, because they are 30th in the league right now in goals scored, and yet Dustin Wolf has just been outstanding, and they keep hanging around, and it just seems like they have surprised even themselves with the way things are going this year.
I would love to see as many Canadian teams in the playoffs as possible. The barns get rocking, the ice starts thawing up north, and I just think it'd be good for the game to see either Calgary or Vancouver make the playoffs. Much like Montreal in the Eastern Conference, we know there's nothing like the Bell Center in the playoffs in the National Hockey League, but they're making it hard on themselves, and I mean, St. Louis is making it hard on them as well. I want to see, too, do the Blues have any games left against Vancouver or the Calgary Flames? Because these are going to be critical games. They don't play either. So there's not going to be any of those 4-point games where you can really put a dagger in themselves. And you look at the Blues' upcoming schedule, they've got some tough teams coming up. Nashville, albeit the exception there. But after that, they play at Colorado. They come home and play Detroit, who's going to be hungry. Then they've got Pittsburgh. You can never count out Sidney Crosby, although the Penguins have had a disappointing season. Then they go home to Colorado, at Winnipeg, at Edmonton, and then they finish the season at Seattle and home to Utah. So that's a tough stretch for the St. Louis Blues. So credit to them for banking these points on this streak. And I'm sure that Blues fans are hoping that they're living 2019 all over again. And it's hard to argue with that when you look at the contributions that they're getting. In particular, I want to highlight the 2 guys they got on offer sheets this year. Dylan Holloway has been one of the best players in the league since the Four Nations, and Philip Broberg has provided them with some timely goal scoring as well, while playing very solid defensively. A lot of these Edmonton cast-offs have been great. Ryan McLeod just had a 4-point night for Buffalo on Sunday against Winnipeg. So I just think you got to tip your hat to Doug Armstrong and the St. Louis Blues of what they've done. To me, I'm not going to put you on the spot here. I'll put myself there, Gil. I think what you see is what you're going to get here in the West. As unfortunate it is, I think both Calgary and Vancouver miss, and I think you're going to see St. Louis in the first wild card spot and Minnesota in the second. And wouldn't that be a boost though if they get that second wild card, but then get Eriksson Ek and Kaprizov back for a playoff against Winnipeg? That would be kind of their fox in the hole or silver lining, that they could provide some offense. And we know Winnipeg struggled in the first round of the playoffs the last 2 years, albeit Minnesota's not Colorado or Vegas, the 2 teams that have beat Winnipeg the last 2 years. Going to be fantastic to see down the stretch in the Western Conference wild card. One thing's for sure, the LA Kings are going to play the Edmonton Oilers. It's just, you can set your clock to it in September. So we'll get to that on the other side of the break. We're also going to touch on John Tortorella's comments after the Philadelphia Flyers got their lunch fed to them by the Toronto Maple Leafs last night. What what a press conference this was. We'll discuss it next. You're listening to Locked On NHL, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Trade Coffee. If you're like me, your mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee. I got Trade Coffee in here. I got tired of settling for grocery store brands that just weren't cutting it. That's why I turned to Trade. And let me tell you, this coffee's next level. Trade is the #1 specialty coffee marketplace in the U.S., bringing you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees, curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you'd like, they'll handpick the perfect match for you. My first bag was a game changer, smooth, rich flavor, and the subscription makes it so easy. No more last-minute grocery store runs and settling for whatever is on the shelf. If you don't love your first bag, no worries. Trade will replace it for free until they get it just right. Right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com/LockedOnNHL for 40% off your order. That's drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. Welcome back, Locked On NHL, your team every day. We're part of Locked On Podcast Network. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find me 5 days a week over at Locked On Ottawa Senators. With me is Gil Martin from Locked On New York Islanders. And the LA Kings, they started the season on a massive road trip, but they're back. Their home record is astounding. And here to break down a 3-1 win last night over the New York Rangers is Eddie Garcia.
The LA Kings power their way to a win. I'm Eddie Garcia, host of Locked On LA Kings. The Kings continue to roll on home ice with a 3-1 win over the New York Rangers, but the Kings were able to get this win by doing something in a game they hadn't done since the third game of the NHL season. The Kings scored 2 goals, including the game winner from Philip Deneau, on the power play. It's the first time since October 14th the Kings' woeful power play has scored 2 goals in a game. Kevin Fiala had the other power play goal plus an empty netter to seal it. He now has 28 goals in the season, and goalie Darcy Kemper continues to be fantastic. He had 22 saves in the latest win. He's now 14-0-1 in his last 15 starts at home. He's allowed a total of 8 goals in his last 8 starts while posting a 7-1 record. One down note for the Kings as rugged forward Tanner Jeannot left the game in the third period with a non-contact injury, didn't return. He will not accompany the team on their road trip to Colorado on Thursday. Kings now have a 2-point lead on Edmonton for second place in the Pacific Division and home ice advantage in their likely first-round playoff matchup.
That's Eddie Garcia from Locked On LA Kings. And Gil, he mentioned home ice there. Just how important is that for you in the always first-round matchup between the Edmonton Oilers and LA Kings?
I think it's vital, especially for the LA Kings. This is a team that is 26-3-4 on home ice. Think about that. They have more overtime and shootout losses than regulation losses, and just an unbelievable home record on the road. They're 5 games under NHL 500. Edmonton, not quite as good at home, but still very good. But they are 6 games over NHL 500 on the road. So for LA, getting an extra game at home and potentially a game 7 at home might be the key for them to end their playoff jinx against the Edmonton Oilers.
And it's just that, like, that's so frustrating. And I live in Winnipeg, so I hear all about how great the Winnipeg Jets were in the 80s, but they never got out of the first round because they kept having to play Wayne Gretzky and the Edmonton Oilers. So it was one of those situations, it feels like, for LA, but they're a much different team now. Darcy Kemper has been great for them in goal, huge offseason pickup for them. 2 years ago, it was Eunice Korpisalo in net, and last year they just could not get a consistency in their game. They did not win 2 games in a row that whole series. The first 4 games alternated, and then Edmonton took the final 2, 6-3 at home, and then they beat them 5-4 in Los Angeles in that first round series. So I love it as a hockey fan. I think it's a great matchup, but if you're an LA Kings fan, you got to be thinking, like, can we not see Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl in the first round, please?
Yeah, it's just been so frustrating. And I think, again, you sort of revisit the issue of the playoff format. Is it better to have 2 division rivals like this play in the playoffs 4 years in a row? Or is it better to go 1-8 in the conference and have more of a variety of playoff opponents? You get more intense rivalries if you meet, I'm sure LA Kings fans have no love whatsoever for the Edmonton Oilers at this point, and vice versa. But, is it fair to the Kings to have to face Edmonton when there are teams that have had worse records that are facing easier playoff opponents in the first round?
There's no team that home ice matters more to than the LA Kings, and 4 straight wins for them has put them in a good spot. They have played the same amount of games as Edmonton, and they are 2 points up. So we'll be following that throughout the rest of the season. John Tortorella made noise last night after the Philadelphia Flyers were completely, I would say, embarrassed in Toronto. 7-2, the final score in that one. You've got the quote pulled up, so why don't you read it off, and we'll discuss how Torts is not happy with where things are at with Philly.
Tortorella after the game telling reporters, "It's my job to prepare this team in this type of situation. I haven't done a good enough job the past couple of games. This falls on me. I'm not really interested in learning how to coach in this type of season where we're at right now, but I have to do a better job."
Interesting. That sounds like the kind of guy who didn't understand the process that Philly's going through. They've traded for all these draft picks. They have all these prospects. Like, does he think it's a surprise they're not in the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand it being a disappointment, especially because they did have a better start. But, this team, I don't think the Flyers were expected to make the playoffs this year, according to most experts. And it is a rebuilding process, as you alluded to. So I can understand his frustration. I can understand his disappointment. But realistically, this is roughly where the Flyers were expected to be.
Do you think this gives any hint of whether or not Torts will be back next season?
I think it opens up a lot of questions. I mean, the thing about John Tortorella, he does tend to get a lot out of his players. But he also seems, because of his style, to have an expiration date where after 2 or 3 years, maybe the players start to tune him out or they just get tired of his message. So it'll be interesting to see whether Torts is back next season in Philadelphia.
I didn't realize it had gotten this bad. The Flyers don't have a single regulation win since February 25th, Gil.
Yeah, that's not good. And, you've gone more than a month without a regulation win. You're not making the playoffs. You're not contending for the playoffs.
And only 2 wins overall since then, a shootout win over Winnipeg and a shootout win over the Tampa Bay Lightning. Ironically, those are 2 of the best teams in the National Hockey League, but lots of L's in the middle for that. The Flyers have also lost 6 straight games. They're 1-10-1 in their last 12. So we'll see if the ticking time bomb goes off here as the Philadelphia Flyers have some home games coming up. We'll see if there's frustration from the fans. We know Philly fans aren't afraid to say how they feel and show it. They've got Montreal, Buffalo, and Nashville coming up on this 3-game homestand. Gil, any final thoughts on today's show?
Just really enjoying this playoff race. Both conferences coming down to the wire, and it's going to be a great sprint to the finish. And it's going to be tough to see who gets in because no team is consistent, but every team has their moments.
And every team has a show here on the Locked On NHL Network. Make sure to like and subscribe everywhere you get podcasts. We appreciate you making us your first listen today on March 26th. Go make your second listen, another show here on the Locked On NHL Network. We have local experts on the biggest stories 5 days a week, like the Locked On Islanders podcast, and they're hosting the Vancouver Canucks in a huge game on both sides of the wild card race. You can find me at Locked On Ottawa Senators. That's Gil Martin. I'm Ross Levitan, and this has been another edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, your team every day.